House Un-American Activities Committee began 1947 hearings into communists in government to put pressure on President Truman to silence those who advocated progressive reforms as tools of the communists, to embarrass the president if communists were found, to push the president to adopt a strict loyalty program, and to provide an issue for Republicans to use against the Democrats in the 1948 elections. If you refused to answer the questions posed by the congressman witnesses, you were branded as Fifth Amendment communists, and if the witnesses answered the questions, they were asked about past associations and individuals. Witnesses who failed to plead the Fifth Amendment but refused to answer questions posed by the members of the House Un-American Activities Committee were charged with contempt of Congress and were subject to fines and prison terms of up to 2 years. House Un-American Activities Committee went after Hollywood as well, holding hearings several times between 1946 and 1953, looking for communists in the film industry. The first chair of House Un-American Activities Committee, Martin Dies, went after the Anti-Nazi League as communist in 1938, and in 1940 came back to investigate James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, Frederick March, and the writer Philip Dunn. The House Un-American Activities Committee came back in 1947 looking for communists. Some members of the Hollywood community organized the Committee for the First Amendment to resist the investigations, including prominent individuals like Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, John Garfield, and Gregory Peck. However, the United Front by Hollywood against the investigations ended when a series of friendly witnesses appeared led by Walt Disney, Jack Warner, and Louis B. Mayer. The studio heads met and agreed to blacklist anyone who failed to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. A group of writers and directors, known as the Hollywood 10, refused to cooperate, hoping to make a stand against the committee, but their actions failed, and all were found in contempt of Congress and sentenced to prison terms. Federal courts upheld the convictions, and the Supreme Court refused to listen to appeals from the Hollywood 10. From 1947 to 1960, those who failed to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee in Hollywood or on television found themselves without work and were blacklisted. Some of the blacklisted entertainers, writers, and directors included Michael Wilson, Zero Mostel, Paul Robeson, Pete Seeger, Burl Ives, Lena Horne, Leonard Bernstein, and Lee Grant. J. Parnell Thomas, chair of the House Un-American Activities Committee, advised the studios to make anti-communist films, and the studios obliged, making films like Iron Curtain and Walk a Crooked Mile in 1948. By the early 1950s, studios also stopped making social problems films that looked at issues like the status of African Americans or anti-Semitism, for fear of the House Un-American Activities Committee criticizing films as un-American. One independently made film, Salt of the Earth, a 1954 film about the plight of Mexican-American mine workers in New Mexico, came under the sights of the House Un-American Activities Committee, becoming the most censored film of the anti-communist paranoia in the 1950s. The hysteria about communists extended to colleges and public schools, leading to people losing their jobs, as well as joining the ranks of those blacklisted during the late 1940s and the 1950s. In Hollywood, the anti-communist hysteria led to the destruction of careers, loss of creativity, and an atmosphere of fear, and contributed to the early deaths of John Garfield and Canada Lee, among a half-dozen others. Bowing to the pressure to take a strong stance against domestic security risks and possible communists, President Truman issued an executive order in 1947 creating a loyalty program, requiring that every government employee from scientist to janitor be investigated and anyone with reasonable grounds of disloyalty be dismissed. The loyalty investigations found no evidence of any serious problems within the Truman administration or risks from government employees, but 378 people lost their jobs since evidence of homosexuality was considered sufficient grounds for dismissal, and people risked loss of employment if their relatives' loyalty could be questioned. Similar loyalty programs were instituted in state and local governments. In New York City alone, 300 teachers lost their jobs as alleged security risks. Anyone with questionable political views or questionable associations could end up losing their jobs and on a blacklist including ministers, radio commentators, librarians, historians, or math professors. In 1953, Edward R. Murrow, in his See It Now broadcast of the case of Milo Radolovich, exposed the excesses of the climate of fear and guilt by association. Showing that he would not tolerate domestic extremists, President Truman supported the indictment and trial in January of 1949 of 11 communist leaders. The federal government charged them under the 1940 Alien Registration Act, or the Smith Act, that made it a crime to advocate the overthrow of the government. They were convicted, sentenced to prison, and the Supreme Court upheld the convictions in 1951. However, the strong stand taken by President Truman against domestic communists and disloyal government employees did not protect the president from Republican charges that his administration harbored communists. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February 1950 and claimed that he had a list of 205 card-carrying communists in the State Department. He never produced the list, but his style got publicity, and McCarthy went after General Marshall, who served as Secretary of State, and a number of the China experts in the State Department like Owen Lattimore, charging that they were responsible for the fall of China to the communists. In the 1950 elections, he went after several Democratic senators, charging them with being communists or being soft on communism. 4 lost, including Millard Tydings of Maryland, who took on McCarthy in the Senate. This gave McCarthy political street credit with the Republican Party and led to the coining of the phrase McCarthyism for the witchcraft hysteria of the period. McCarthy's stature rose after the 1950 elections, and he became an important political tool for the Republican Party leaders, like Senator Robert Taft, who hoped to win the 1952 congressional and presidential elections. McCarthy tapped into public sentiment upset about the communism of Eastern Europe, the fall of China, fear of spies, Russian acquisition of the atomic bomb in 1949, and the real war in Korea in 1950. A few Republicans, like former Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, issued a declaration of conscience denouncing the tactics of McCarthy, but the majority of Republican leaders found McCarthy's tactics useful and encouraged him to continue his attacks.